There's no better way to advance gender equality than making sure women have a place at the tables where decisions are made.
Because of inequities in how systems have been designed and also harmful gender norms, women all around the world are blocked from reaching their full potential.
We see women and girls being stripped of their agency and decision-making power by the policies that govern them and also tradition and norms that inform their experiences and the treatment in the workplace, community, and at home.
Esse é um problema que afeta todas as esferas, econômica, política e social.
There's a really important need for philanthropy to dramatically increase its resourcing of women's rights and gender equality work.
And that's where the Co-Impact Gender Fund comes in. We're proud to join with other donors and learn from those working to advance gender equality around the world.
Our goal is to significantly grow the funding for gender equality and to advance a more just and effective approach to giving.
The coming together between funders and program partners and between philanthropists from across Africa and the world is critical. We must tackle this collaboratively.
This will require enhanced collective agency of women and strong alliances of diverse actors to alter the narratives that creates barrier and exclusion to the path for realization of gender equality.
At the same time, we need women, especially those who are less represented, like women from the global south, to be equipped with the tools, the informations, and the networks that are necessary to actually break the glass ceiling.
Our vision and purpose is twofold: to give priority to women legal practitioners and enable them to be leaders in international law, and to simultaneously address serious violations of international law.
Nós queremos o fim da epidemia de feminicídios no Brasil. Não dá mais para aceitar mortes que são evitáveis.
Breakthrough plans to create a gender transformative education system that is empathetic and responsive to the needs of adolescent girls.
En X, soñamos con un sistema de impartición de justicia que en lugar de criminalizar y estigmatizar, revierta la desigualdad.
We hope to produce and disseminate knowledge about how law creates discrimination and prevents women from achieving the goals that they set out for themselves.
Women collectives and the leadership skills could actually facilitate systems with governments and with local institutions for equitable distribution of resources.
We support our partners' vision and strategy for change because they have the contextual knowledge, the lived experience, and the deep expertise to lead this work.
We can't wait 136 years for men and women to reach gender parity. Our people and planet are out of time.
This is our once-in-a-generation chance to rebuild our systems to finally work for women and girls.
Gender Fund is committed to bring this change, and I'm truly excited to be a part of this journey.
This Gender Fund has the potential to directly and indirectly transform millions of lives around the world.
Co-Impact has the most amazing opportunity to be part of the catalyzing of a whole new wave of change.
We are all full of hope, anticipation, and excitement for all the systemic change that we know that this fund is going to make possible.
We envision a world where all people can live fulfilling lives, where systems and societies are just and inclusive, and where all women can exercise power, agency, and leadership at all levels.
I'm seeing a model that really works.
Really excited to see that approach scale and be taken further and to many others.
Let's work together to make it a success.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to all of you. I am so incredibly delighted to be here with everyone today and in community with those on the video, the panelists that have joined here today, and with all of you. So really, thank you for joining us. This is the second of our new conversation series, and it is, we rotate between our team. So I have the great pleasure of getting to be the host today for this session, which is particularly special because it is around the launch of the Gender Fund that we have been working on with so many of you over the last many months, consultation with so many of you as well. And so for those of you that I haven't met, I'm the founder and CEO of CoImpact, and I am in conversation today with three amazing leaders. So I'm going to turn over to each of them to introduce themselves shortly. But at first I'll say, so we have Laura Garcia, who is the president of Global Greengrants Fund, president and CEO of Global Greengrants Fund, and I'm very excited to share a member of CoImpact's new board of directors. So Laura, maybe see if you can join on too. And then enormously excited as well that Crystal Simeoni is joining us as well, and is the director for the Nawi Collective, and also delighted to share that she's an advisory board member for the Gender Fund. Thank you, Crystal. And then also, we are also joined by Sohini B, who is the CEO of Breakthrough Trust and a key program partner of CoImpact's working, as you heard in the video, to make education systems more gender inclusive. So with that, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Maybe I'll start with Laura, please.
Sure. Hi, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited about today's launch. I'm Laura Garcia. I'm Mexican. I used to be the executive director of Fondo Semillas, a feminist fund, and now I'm based in Colorado, United States, and I lead Global Greengrants Fund, which is an organization that mobilizes resources to support grassroots environmental justice movements. Thank you.
Laura. And Crystal, can you go next?
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here among such amazing women. I'm really excited about the fund. My name is Crystal. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I identify as a Pan-African feminist. I work on macro-level economic justice, changing and disrupting narrative systems, policies. That's me.
Thanks, Crystal. And over to you, Sohini.
Thank you, Olivia. Very excited to be here. My name is Sohini, and I work with an organization called Breakthrough that has been working to transform gender norms to make violence against women and girls unacceptable for the past 2 decades. I am currently the CEO. I've spent about 30 plus years in this sector and have always been passionate about gender equality and working with women and girls. So really excited about the Gender Fund, and we'll talk a lot more about it, I'm sure.
So thank you so much, Laura, Crystal, and Sohini. So for everybody here, you can see that we're in for a really thoughtful conversation today. So thank you to each of you. And what I'm hoping for this, and what we discussed as well amongst the 4 of us, is that hopefully this feels a bit like we're at a table all together. The 4 of us, as well as with all of you as well in the chat, which I guess would be a large table, but really so that it feels like it's a conversation in as much as we can in this virtual life that we're in. And so I'm excited for that to happen. We will be asking those of you in the chat, so we see you're already introducing yourselves, thank you so much. And we will ask a few questions of you too, so hopefully we can make it as interactive as we can using this format. Because really, as I think we all know well, it really is all about community, and it's about how we come together to be able to see the change that we want to see. And so feeling this kind of community, I'm so excited about this discussion today. So with that, I will quickly move into the discussion. But before we do that, I would just add a little bit of context, because we are launching the Gender Fund today and wanted to give a little bit more context about it for those that may not be as familiar. So as you heard in the opening video, really the goal of this fund is to support partners that are working to make systems more just and more inclusive. It's about advancing women's power and agency and leadership across all levels, whether it's also a household level, community, in national office, really throughout society, and also to address harmful gender norms. So you'll be hearing more about all of this in the conversation that we're having today. And also, as so many of you have shared with us, and as we've all discussed, the how really matters. So it's also about our focus is on supporting our program partners and our program partners' vision, of whom are here with us. I can see it in the chat. And so it's really all about us being supporting those that are really leading this work and that are rooted in the communities where they're working, and doing so with large and flexible grants over the long term. We are just getting started with this fund, so we can share more about it. But really, for today, we're going to hear from Laura and Crystal and Sohini on a few of the topics that we've all been both thinking about, grappling with, and wanted to invite this conversation amongst all of us today. So that's enough from me. What I would like to start with is the topic for today's session is galvanizing collective action for gender equality. And so to the panelists, I would love to ask you, when you think about gender equality, what does that mean to you? What is the vision that you would have if we were in a world where there was gender equality? What is that? You know, we have different definitions for it. And so what do you see as that in terms of the vision? And I think I'll start with you, Sohini.
Thank you, Olivia. Can I take a step back a bit and talk a bit about gender equity that lies at the core of gender equality and also at the core of Breakthrough's thinking? And that's the process of fairness, you know, being fair to women, girls, and gender minorities, everybody who has been, you know, historically and socially marginalized. And so that fairness has to include strategies and measures that should be available to compensate for that historical and social marginalization. That prevents women and girls and gender minorities from otherwise operating on an absolutely level playing field. You know, we do not have that. So gender equality actually requires equal enjoyment by women and girls and gender minorities of socially valued goods, opportunities, resources. It means that all of us enjoy the same status in a society, regardless of their genders, and enjoy the same entitlements to all human rights, enjoy the same level of respect in the community, and can take advantage of the same opportunities. But a lot of it is actually the ability to share power, you know, power to shape the outcomes of the choices that we make in lives, and everybody must have an equal share of that. So eventually gender equality will ensure that everyone actually is reaching their full potential. That's been my understanding, and that's where we come from in our work with young boys and girls and other gender minorities in the communities that we work in.
That's a really powerful vision, Sohini. Crystal, you want to build on that and share your perspective?
Sure. So I'm joining you from Nairobi, where we're supporting Femnet to convene the first ever convening on the continent on the CSW theme. It's been a really powerful space of disruption. And so I asked a few feminists that were here what they thought gender equality means to them. And I got this from Boki Williams, who is the SRHR lead at Akinamama Africa. And she had this to say, which really speaks the words right out of my soul. And I quote, "Gender equality is now a phrase that is used to placate women and girls and essentialize girlhood and womanhood, a breed language that is used to pretend that the structure that upholds our current realities, such as racism, capitalism, white imperialism, are not still killing us, a term to distract us from the fact that building power for women, girls, and gender-expansive persons in countries that hold up the world is constantly being co-opted and weaponized against us. As Toni Morrison said about racism, the term is being used to keep us doing the work, keep us explaining over and over again the reason for our being over again. So I not only rely on gender equality, I rely on feminism that recognizes the political and the need for ideology. And I 100% agree with that.
Thanks, Crystal. And the power of words and then actually what one is using, I think is so key. And Laura, add your perspective.
I also agree 100% on what Crystal was just mentioning, and Sohini too. For me, gender equality is not just the ability to have equal opportunities between men and women, but to actually be able to change entire economic, political, social, and cultural systems that have been constructed historically from that patriarchal vision of the world. So male domination has been the foundation with which other inequalities are constructed. And this is why, in my view, feminism is the most important emancipatory movement that we have, especially intersectional feminisms. And one of feminism's biggest gifts for me personally in my life, but I also think for society, is that it gives us the opportunities to imagine different and better futures. With feminism, we empower our dreams with endless possibilities by reminding us that all oppressions are human inventions that can be overturned, and no matter how deeply ingrained they are. And in recent years, this feminist hope has been influencing philanthropy, which is the reason why we're here today in this launch. And there's a growing interest in financing gender equality. However, fundamentalist and patriarchal agendas are also receiving more and more funding. So we need to pay attention to that. And women's rights defenders are facing increasing violence, and civic spaces are closing. So the complexity behind these broken social systems requires us not only more funding, but better funding. And I know that we will be talking about that. So for now, that my definition of gender equality actually is at the root of all of our social problems and society. And one thing that I have been tackling in the last in this last few years is the false appreciation that gender equality only includes girls and women, and that it's only an issue of women. It's actually at the foundation of renovating all of our systems towards justice and equality for all.
So I think at the core of what all three of you are saying is this point around power and politics, and also really that it needs to be, and that what do our systems actually look like, and that it is about justice at its core across all. And that I think, and actually using language as well, like intersectional feminism, and being and actually thinking about what language we're using when we're talking about this. Thank you for those really thoughtful responses. I want to switch to something else that we've spent some time amongst us also talking about, and wanted to get your perspectives on as well. Oh, great, thanks, Renee. I forgot to mention in the chat to please also share your thoughts on gender equality. So yeah, would love your perspectives as well on this. And then for the panelists, so we've been thinking a lot about this question of scale. And at its core, really, it's about when we think about scale, so we know that many of the issues that we face are systemic, they cut across for everyone, right? So in a sense, it's exactly what you were talking about here. It's all of our systems. And so, and at the same time, when you talk about scale, it is also about justice, it's about equity. And it's also that we know that it is also about scale reaching everyone, and making sure in particular that if a system works for those that are the most marginalized, then it work for that's the core, right? So that it needs to be, when we're thinking about scale, it needs to reach the last mile, it needs to reach those, it needs to reach everyone. And so I would love to ask you how you think about this question of scale, and how do you make sure to sort of balance between when you think about scale, but then you also think about each individual, right? So and how to think about that also from the grassroots through to systems, and how to consider that. So I'd love to get perspectives from you. I'll start with Laura.
Thank you, Olivia. In my career and experience, I have learned from gender equality movements that changing oppressive systems is not just a possibility, but something that only depends on us and nothing more. And in the past years, I have seen more and more young students lead change in their universities, marches in the street grow exponentially, Particularly in Latin America, we have been seeing that there are more and more women environmental defenders linking their work with gender justice. A ton of economic studies modeling how growth and prosperity will never occur if we continue not to give economic value to unpaid care and domestic work. So there's a growing movement that's scaling up. And there are more and more changes that are already pointing towards this unstoppable progress in gender equality, which is very exciting. And it is led especially by social movements, social feminist movements. But what does it mean to scale? I think that something that systems theory can teach us is that scaling really requires and depends on a complex web of interrelations. It sometimes requires large amount of funding towards policy changer, but most often it depends on a generation of strong and equitable relationships between local actors and the interconnectedness of others outside their local communities. So to topple dominant systems, if we're to scale that, the large problems and if we're to scale, the solutions of large problems, there are many actions that occur kind of under the water. Revolutions are not spontaneous. They are the result of living systems of collaboration and continuous relationship and connected actions and change of behaviors. And all of that is required to scale effectively. So feminists often question and criticize the narratives of scaling, not because we don't share the vision of systemic change in the large scale. This is a criticism that we have as feminists been receiving, like that we are only focused in local and little actions, and that's not true. What we really criticize is the focus on scaling as a strategy that is only looking at growth and not depth. And in many ways, patriarchy informs this type of thinking around as if scaling were only to do with more money or more things and more impositions to local systems. And in fact, what we're learning from social movements is that the best alternatives to the systems are already happening in the grassroots level. So how do we scale up that grassroots spontaneity and vision and organizing? We need to look at intersectionality and the interdependence of rights. So the biggest issues we know that don't exist independently of other social problems. So to scale is also important to look at how different rights are interdependent. We cannot have climate justice without racial justice. We cannot have gender equality without economic equality. And also that we cannot tackle, for example, gender-based violence without addressing forced marriage or lack of education or women's land rights. So to scale, we need to look at interdependence and at intersectionality, and also everything that is done in movements that is sometimes invisible to the eye of funders and to the eyes of the entrepreneurial type of culture that is not permitting us to go deep. If we want to expand, we need to first go deep.
Thanks, Laura. And I think this point of about growth and depth, and really thinking about the interdependence and also intersectionality across everything when we are talking about scale. I would love to keep talking more about that. And actually, let me first though go to Sohini, because you're really working with systems and at scale, and I imagine a lot of what Laura said will resonate. So what are your thoughts on this question?
See, essentially what we understand by scale is something that has come down to us from a capitalistic system of economy. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm not here to make a value judgment. I'm as much a benefiter of that economy as everybody else. But when we look at an innovation and think about how that can reach 100,000, then a 10 million, then 100 million, we have this incremental way of looking at things. And then, the social sector becomes obsessed with, just as Laura said, entrepreneurship and innovation. Everyone's excited about starting something new rather than scaling what has already been proven to work. There are so many examples of that. And so, you know, as a result, a lot of funding goes to exciting new innovations in terms of products and services. And somehow no one wants to work on things that actually has proven to be working. Also, scale is not that much fun, you know, it's scale needs operation manuals, quality controls, you know, partnership profiles, scale needs policies and processes and procedures. It's boring. So innovative small projects are fun, quick to show impact. You can then move on to better things. But you need to be looking at doing this more strategically, changing that one thing within a system that can actually change something forever. And that will anyway reach millions. You do not have to kind of take it to your, 100,000 consumer base, incrementally. So a sustained progress towards gender equality can only be achieved by transforming very entrenched social norms and practices. This requires shifts in power that can only be brought about through a long-term systemic thinking, in any of the systems that you are working in. So, I see three things which are very, very important in this. The need to work together with your, co-workers in other civil society organizations. There is evidence that shows that, as Laura was saying, that women's rights activism, feminist movements are key drivers of change to address gender inequality. It has been there's a large-scale quantitative study based on data from over 4 decades across 70 countries that have found that the autonomous women's movements are the single most significant factor in influencing progressive policy on violence against women. Their influence even surpasses that of having women in legislature or progressive political parties. Few normative changes in gender equality would have been possible without the work that has been done. And collective action here is key. Can we look at others and can we bring everybody together into a large-scale systems thinking? Second is that I feel the government is an essential part of that. And when you are working on gender equality, like somebody said in the chat, you're not working on cute little things, you're actually making political statements. You're upsetting the political apple cart. So you're sometimes working against the very government that you want to partner with. So the ability to be an insider looking out as well as an outsider looking in is a tricky one, but that must be navigated. Lastly, where is the support for this kind of work? Moving deep-rooted norms takes time. But if you are successful, you have changed something totally essentially. You need patience to see the impact. This is not going to happen overnight. You need, multi-year core flexible funding that actually will help you to get in all those things that you need to change that system. There are very few organizations supporting this kind of work. So, harmonizing funding from a group of people who really believe in this, like the Gender Fund is doing, is fantastic, and it will give the kind of capital which is needed for at-scale systems change work on gender equality.
So much, Sohini. And I think, as I'm just following some of the comments in the chat, that this really resonates, and that I think, as you say, that both the approach that you're saying in terms of what's needed, and then also how do you have more support for that so that people really are paying attention, even if it's not the thing that funders often want to focus on, and how to then encourage through voices like yours and others here to try to encourage people throughout, whether obviously we're doing that our part, but then hopefully others in community are as well, altogether. So I wanted to go to you next, Crystal, and I'll switch a little bit, just I think looking at time. Which is great. So I wanted to switch now around just to talk a little bit about women's leadership. And one of the things that we have spoken about, and you've also advised us around, is in the area of specifically feminist economists. For those that don't know, one of the things that we're focusing on in the Gender Fund is also really structural barriers to women's leadership in the economics area. And because of how important it is in terms of so many things of influence, public policy, national priorities, and other. And so, Crystal, what I want to ask you is, as you think about specifically in the economics space, what do you think is needed in order to have but basically to change institutions so that we can have more women leaders in this space. And also beyond that, we speak to your perspectives as well as to what's needed then, both getting into the spaces and then also beyond that as well.
Thanks, Olivia. So I'll speak from where I sit, which is I'm a Pan-African feminist and I work on issues regarding the continent of Africa. And so those are multiple fights, right? It's a Pan-African fight against neoliberalism, yes, and neocolonialism. It's a feminist fight against the patriarchy, and then put together, it's this monster of a fight. And so definitely representation is, we're really not anywhere near where we should be, right? But it's indeed a large part of the fight, but it's not the whole part of the fight. And this is where my politics come in. And you know, when Buki talks about the politics and ideology of the fight, this is exactly where it sits and where it's rooted. Not only should we ensure more women in leadership, you know, we have more women in leadership, but what sort of ideology are these women holding in their positions of leadership? It's not enough to be an economist. Neoliberalism, you know, on the continent especially, and globally as well, has really permeated all our institutions of learning in an insidious but very effective way. And so it's churning out these very neoliberal economists that see the world and the economy through a specific lens. Feminist economists, thought and scholarship matter. It is this that is going to begin to shift the cogs of power, to put a lens of power as a point of analysis, to begin to look at the world a little differently. And as you said, or as Sohini said, the people that are, you know, most left behind, how can we center them as we progress? For us here in Africa, like any other region, we have a specific set of very intersecting things that create a uniqueness. Our history from as far back as slavery, and even before then, through to colonialism, through to structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s, and even now as we navigate through a pandemic, that has really shown us that the system really doesn't work for anyone, but a select few who amass wealth subsidized by a majority of us. And so this means an understanding of our relation with the economy, where we sit, and our region's relations with the global economy. Jason Hickel has called a global economic governance system a global apartheid of the economic system, where we definitely don't have space at the table of these decision-making policies, but also women are the least likely to be at that table. We must then analyze all of this in our own voices. We must also look to alternatives defined by us, rooted in our realities. And that work is hard and has to be done collectively and intersectionally. And so when Sohini talks about, you know, scale and building this movement, it has to be done at scale, right? The only change will only happen through, you know, a movement from the ground up, an amassing of people and change and the calling for change from the ground up. But that only matters and that only happens if it's actually rooted in an ideology and a politique. Margaret Thatcher is famous for having said there is no alternative. There is alternatives. There's lots of women's rights organizations, feminist organizations that are calling for different pathways, alternatives. And so as Sohini says, the feminist movements must be funded. They must be funded with core funding, flexible funding that, you know, allows them to dream. And the work of dreaming, and as I said today here in Nairobi, is political. Radical thought, radical imagination is at the heart of, you know, pushing for change. And this dreaming, this imagination is really what we must fund. So we have leaders who are pushing this agenda.
The dreaming and the imagination is what we must fund. Yeah, I think and this relates to some of what we were talking about earlier too, around how we think about the role of power and politics throughout. So let me actually go to you next, Sohini, because I wanted to ask you specifically as thinking about your work, and you spoke a bit about this earlier as well, but you of course have been working for many years and also given a lot of thought to this question of within the education system, how, and when you're thinking about social norms, talking about women in the system, right? So what needs to happen in order for there to be more, whether it's the administrators or the trainers or the curriculum developers, the principals, what do you think needs to happen in order for things to fundamentally shift, for there to be more leaders throughout the whole system?
So the 3 or 4 very important things. When we talk about creating a gender transformative education system, gender is not a priority in the way, and at least I'm talking about India here mostly, gender is not a priority in the way the whole education reform is going. Yes, gender is mentioned in our national education policy, but the roadmap is not clear. And so in the absence of an unclear roadmap, it's very clear that you are not actually putting as much stress on this as you should be. So it's for us to actually co-create the roadmap along with the government to see what can be actually beneficial. So a whole lot of work is around the pedagogy, not just only for the adolescents in the classroom, but also for the teachers. In India, if you must remember, a large of the workforce of teachers are women, and in a way it has to appeal to them. Why are we talking about gender in your in your life, in your classroom? It has to appeal to them to be able to actually make a change in the whole teacher training curriculum and bring in gender into that. Secondly, the curriculum, though the curriculum has changed a lot, but yet the curriculum is very gendered. We still put emphasis on women's place is domestic, men's place is outside. We still talk in binaries. There's no actually space for gender non-binaries, or not even a single picture in a workbook which is of somebody in a wheelchair. So ability and sexual orientation and gender non-binaries are not featuring anywhere, and not even simple things about a woman's role in the whole outer world. So the curriculum needs to go through a thing. But most importantly, people who are in charge of the systems, who actually pushes teachers or do not push them, the whole administrative department needs to actually start looking at it as something which is important. For India to actually take notice of literacy and learning and numeracy took at least 12 to 15 years. So if we kind of put a focus on gender transformative education and keep on showing the results and keep on showing a mirror to the government saying, this is what happens if you make the education system more gender transformative, people in 10 years' time probably will sit up and take notice. But in the meantime, we would have created much more equitable classrooms, much more equitable, responsive classrooms, and we would have bred a group of adolescents, a whole generation of adolescents who have come out with much more gender progressive views than the earlier generation. So that's, in a nutshell, is the idea that we are working on.
Then that is, I think, a really powerful vision of what could be in terms of going back to the earlier of what does that look like. So Laura, I want to end with you before I'm going to go to each of the panelists for the short response afterwards before we turn to Q&A. So also I'll just ask for everybody who's here with us, please do think of any questions that you would have. So we won't be able to get to very many of them, but we would love to hear from you, and then we'll be able to answer a few. So so Laura, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned this earlier, the role of philanthropy. So of course, this is what we at Co-Impact are focused on, which is how can philanthropy come together to support the very work that we've been talking about here today. And I personally am very focused on this, our whole team is, and so many of us here in this broader virtual community of us, I think, are really thinking about this. And so tell us, what do you think when you think about sort of, if you could dream what philanthropy actually would look like, be like, do, what would that be to be most effective?
Sure, thank you, Olivia. I think that we need to just first remember that while funding for gender equality has been rising over the last decade, and I mentioned that, we are still facing very serious, worrisome numbers here. Only 1% of funding has reached women's organizations. The change that we have been talking about today with my colleagues here, we've mentioned over and over again the importance of social movements for change to happen, for systemic change to happen. And philanthropy, in many ways, what I mostly criticize about it is that it mirrors the structures of inequality in a very clear way, and that's what I hope that that we can continue to change. Something that is significant is that the Gender Fund, for example, is committed to bringing resources into this grossly underfunded space and to address gender systems and not just projects. And I think that bringing a focus like the Gender Fund is doing in changing the structures, the laws and policies and processes of governments and how markets function and how social norms are shaped and enforced, that's an important thing to pay attention to. It's quite unusual for philanthropy to look at those things. And it's also quite unusual to be committed to flexible funding and long-term funding, something which is incredibly important. I think that to a similar way that what Sohini and I were addressing in scaling, something that's important for us is to pay attention that quantity in funding is less important than flexibility, trust, long-term funding, the accompaniment of and sharing power, like my colleagues were saying. So all of those things are probably the biggest challenges in philanthropy right now, but I'm excited that this organization, Co-Impact, for example, is bringing philanthropists and private sector partners and funders that were usually not as clear on paying attention to the systemic change that's needed for gender equality, and bringing it together in what I hope can become a culture, a feminist culture of philanthropy, and democratizing resources in an anti-colonialist way in the global South. And I think that we need to continue advocating for changing philanthropy, but hopefully this fund can pay attention to the fact that even if $1 billion has been committed, we urgently need investments to include feminist principles, feminist values, accountability that women's organizations deserve and that we haven't seen yet in philanthropy. So I think that also philanthropy is a powerful vehicle to push and to accelerate transformation, definitely. And philanthropy alone cannot drive change, but it can become a key enabler. It can become a financial support that otherwise feminist agendas find it very hard to push things forward, especially in a moment of polycrisis and in a moment, like I said, where there's millions and millions of dollars being pushed towards anti-rights agendas and fundamentalist agendas. So we absolutely need to be paying attention to that disparity and to push the boundaries that traditional philanthropy has laid. And I think that there's a lot of hope to be mentioned here. So I don't want to just be critical of traditional philanthropy. I think that there's movement and there's inertia towards paying attention to grassroots movements, which have been grossly underfunded, and also with a feminist approach and values.
Thanks, Laura. I share the hope and also the excitement of saying but already we're starting to see that where people are coming together and saying, how do we then both fund in this way and then also encourage others to come join alongside. And then I think your point of also that philanthropy is basically one part, right? It needs to be at the table, but not be the one that's driving it. And actually, how do you then sit alongside in collaboration with everyone who's sitting here and so many others too, in terms of being able to see the kind of change that you were all talking about throughout. So on that, I actually wanted to end with, before we go to the Q&A, to ask each of you in a sort of quick round to imagine. So if we are sitting here 10 years from now, and we are imagining, looking at saying, okay, this is what the gender, through the work that we're doing together, what is it that we actually could see? And I think maybe if you think about it from the perspective of you all three of you are advising us and also suggesting we're all in this together in collaboration. What's our call to action in terms of sort of what do we need to see in 10 years from now to be able to be looking back and say what really is that vision? I'd love to hear from each of you on that, and then we'll turn to Q&A from others. So why don't we start this time with Sohini, then Laura, and then Crystal.
So in my idealist frame of mind, in 10 years time, I would see the gender fund working its way out of the space, because we'd have done all the changes that were needed to done, and we wouldn't need a special gender fund. But in my practical frame of mind, at least 3-4 things. One is that why should women's rights organizations and organizations that work on gender should forever be relegated to being small organizations working very hard with a limited amount of communities, going from one community to one community, and begging and borrowing for money from funders to actually do that. If the gender fund really takes off and does all that it was supposed to do, we would see a sea change in that. We would see ideas that would go to scale in a much more enabling way, in a way that would involve lots more organizations, lots more communities in that process of growth. And it would also, create a group of feminist leaders, leaders of these changes, and in a transformative vision of a just world, which is free from poverty, oppression, patriarchy, requires transformative feminist leaders. Doesn't matter whether they're all women or girls, or anybody can be a feminist leader. Leaders who enable others to lead and build power within them instead of over them. And I'm very passionate about this. And so 2 things always bother me is that one is dismantling bias within the leadership area. So we recognize that society gives us certain advantages that we have not asked for or earned, based on gender, class, race, caste, ability, sexual orientation, everything, education. How can we help and uncover and challenge these forms of discrimination through our way, not only in the community where we are working, but within the organizations where we are working, and that the ultimate test of that kind of a leadership is the spaces we create for others to lead. So the Gender Fund can actually help bring this kind of leadership out in the front. And I wish it all the luck for doing that.
Laura?
I think that one thing that I dream of is that if we are able to really decolonize our thinking, we could potentially imagine, therefore, that philanthropy doesn't exist in the way it is or cease to exist because we will not need it, but rather that we construct a community that is not only fighting injustice and crisis, but building happiness, love, imagination that are very much at the center of feminist thinking. And I imagine in the title of a book of a friend, Jelena Dordevich, the title is "What's the Point of Revolution If We Cannot Dance?" So I imagine a path in these next 10 years where we're not only focused in fighting the injustices and keeping up with the poly-crisis world that we live in, but that we also dance as feminists and that we also have fun and pay attention to care, because that's actually political and that's actually the key to transformation. So hopefully philanthropy can also pay attention to that and can start resembling the change that it wants to create outside, but also within.
Crystal.
Yeah, I'm exhausted with this performance of busyness that the current funding landscape puts on women's rights and feminist organizations. We're writing reports and writing proposals for little bits of money over and over and over again. And in a way, it sort of almost keeping us from doing the thinking and the imagination. Agazit Abate, who's one of our associates, talks about radical imaginings, unbounded visions, and freed up desire. And how do we put that at the center of what we are working on? I'm hoping that in the next 10 years, this fund is the leader and is showing the way for other funds to allow and to open up space, actually not even allow, to open up space for women's rights and feminist organizations to do that radical imagining, to do the work that they know needs to be done on their terms in the way that they want to do it. And I'll read a little bit from a piece that Agazit wrote, and she says, I contributed to this. I hope the Gender Fund contributes to a world where we measure happiness, wellness, leisure, love, safety, shelter, education, freedom, beauty, measure the health of the people, the soil, the waters, and the air, measure life. All of these are signs of wealth, indicators of an economy of abundance for all people, where all gains are shared and all people are cared for, where it is clear that there is enough for the living to live. And in this place, the harvest must always be mutual. And that's the world that I hope that Gender Fund will contribute to. And I'm pretty sure that it will, with the team that is behind it, with the thinking and the care of duty held with this project, with this fund. I think we're going to be a huge contributor to that dream.
That gave me shivers. I have to say, just in terms of just taking a pause and saying, this is what each of you shared, really, in terms of what we need and want to see in the world, and also the kind of call in terms of what we should be doing to make that happen in community and in collaboration. So so thank you. I do want to make sure that we have space for, I think we're probably going to have space for one question. So I will, I've been trying to follow chat while also listening. So I'm going to pick just one. But we did get a few questions in advance. And one of the questions, also knowing just the people in the chat, that I wanted to make sure that people knew. So was around the open call that recently closed at the end of December for proposals. We are actually in the final stages of reviewing those applications. And so we'll be letting those that have applied know within the coming weeks. So we just wanted to make sure that we share that. That's all on our website. So in terms of what the whole process is, so nothing has shifted there. I know we shared some of the initiatives we're already supporting, and then we're also, through this open call, will be supporting additional work as well. So I will share one question, and then maybe I think I'll probably only be able to ask one of you to answer. So whoever wants to take this one so there's a question which is, I think that so for the panelists, how can we get resources directly to youth-led organizations for the work that they are doing to challenge systems and build movements? Who would like to take that one?
I can go, but I don't want to be the last word, so I'll be short in the hopes that my colleagues can join me. One of the things that I've been struggling with in thinking about philanthropy is the lack of good funding mechanisms for larger sources of funding to small or emerging or informal organizations that need this seed funding to be able to sustain their work and their movements. And I think that feminist approaches to doing that with feminist funds, for example, or grassroots funding as well, we need to pay attention to that. We need to ensure that we enable these larger sources of funding to generate the infrastructure and the architecture to be able to then identify and groups and then provide enough long-term and flexible funding. And collaboration is key for that. No one single fund can do it. We need a movement of funds and collaborative partners to be able to answer to this context. And I'm going to pass it quickly to Crystal and Sohini if they want to also speak.
I have nothing more to add to what Laura said, but one of the things is that if gender becomes, important in every funding that goes out, gender is not just only for, organizations working with women. Gender is important in climate action, education, and health. So if every funder actually begins to look at how can you prioritize gender in the work that you are doing and get, smaller women's rights organizations to actually partner with those organizations to show them how to do that, then that would be a very, very sure way of getting money to the women's rights or smaller women's rights organizations. And I also think that smaller women's organizations do find this whole thing that Crystal was saying, writing reports, doing the MEL thing, all of them are burdens. So how can we make it simpler for them to actually work with the money that you are giving them? Those are two things that I just wanted to add to Laura's.
I can be quick in my wrapping, Crystal, if you wanted to get one word in before we close.
Yeah, no, I mean, between Sohini and Laura, they speak magic. Yeah, I wonder, I worry and wonder about funding going to women's rights and feminist organizations who are so passionate about what they're doing, but then are belabored by the administration of it. And I call it a bureaucratic violence. And it really is a violence on women's rights organizations and feminist organizations and activists who want to organize, fight, do the work that they know how to do and the passions that they have in such different ways. But a system reins them in and puts them in this framework that is so capitalist many a time, that has audits and all these things that are so heavy. And audits are important and transparency is important, great. But how can we find middle ground to work with the people in the way that they work? And the industrialization, I call it the industrialization of the movement, where, to be able to attract the money, you have to be a certain way, be registered, and like have all these, structures. And what does that do to the movement? And how is it destroying movements when we're, trying to figure out boards and like all these structures that are supposed to be helpful, but really at the heart of it are so violent to the movement and are really ripping us apart. And so I also challenge the Co-Impact Fund to start thinking about these things and how radically different can we be, and how audacious and how brave and courageous are we to push the needle on these things and push other funders as well to begin to think differently. Because, we always say we can't go back to normal because normal was the problem in the way the world was organized, but also in our response. Life is happening, and I say this all the time, in complexity all at once. Our response has to be as complex as all at once as well. And that makes us sit in discomfort in spaces that we're not used to, in ways of work that we're not comfortable with, and engaging in ways that we don't know. But that's where the magic happens, and that's where we will find our liberation.
So I will just close by saying this has been such a treat to get to spend this time with the three of you, and then also with all of our others around the table in community with us as well. So thank you to everyone for joining. I think what I am so excited about is really saying, how do we see this vision that we've all been talking about here? What can we do to contribute to that in partnership with everyone here and others that aren't here? And what is it that we can really see to have that radical imagination that you talked about in terms of what can really happen in the world? And so I think thinking about that role of philanthropy and how we both imagine and question and really keep learning as to what we can do to be true to what we're really seeking to do as funders and as this community of funders and everybody else, and the program partners, the advisors, everybody coming together. How do we actually do that in partnership so that we can see this kind of shift? And I love the idea of hopefully as that the quote about what's the point of a revolution if you can't dance, I think is so powerful. And so I think it is about the dancing altogether, and seeing that. So it's about all of it. So so thank you all. Thanks to everybody for joining. When you sign off, we will have a survey in the point of learning. So please do let us know any suggestions also for future discussions. We want to keep the discussion going with everybody here. See, some of you we know well, others are newer to people that we know now. And so we're excited to all connect. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much, Crystal. Thank you so much, Sohini. And thanks to everybody who joined us today. And a huge thanks to the Co-Impact team as well, I should say, who are also doing so much for both the launch as well as for all of it. So honored to get to work with all of you. Thank you.